How is everybody doing? And welcome back to another Strength Chat podcast and the first podcast back in 2026. And today I have got a very special guest for you all. He is a doctor of physical therapy, he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and he's also the founder of the Movement System. Today I am joined by the one and only Matt Casturo. How are you doing?
Good. That was a great intro. Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, no problem at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. But I suppose the first question is, how are you? What's kind of been happening in your world recently?
Yeah, man, I'm doing good. I've been busy with two young kids right now, and that's taking up a lot of time. But I'm also into a few different areas in terms of my own thinking and professional development. We can get into this later, but there's some pretty interesting books that I'm reading and literature on plyometrics, some pretty interesting stuff that I've gotten into on, I guess, like endurance training, strength for endurance athletes, hybrid training. My mind's always kind of everywhere answering, like trying to figure out answers to questions. I think that's what I kind of started with the field is like I had a lot of questions. Let me go out there and try to find the answers and then share what I learned. And, 10 years later, still doing it.
Oh, cool. And with that, did you, especially with it being kind of New Year's and Christmas, did you have any downtime, or was it quite busy? Have things kind of ramped up now? We're kind of in the new year. How's kind of been that period been for you?
Yeah, yeah. No, I was able to take some time downtime a little bit. I kind of like to have at least an hour or two a day where I can kind of focus and read something or do a little bit of work. And luckily with family around, I had that time. But then the rest of the day, just kind of chilled with family. But now, New Year, ready to ramp back up into it, and I think get right back into it.
Yeah. All right. Cool. And I know you've touched on a couple of things there. Learning, wanting to put content out there. But for
Hmm.
everyone listening, and I know I did a little bit of a brief introduction at the start there, but
Hmm.
for everyone listening who might not know your background in terms of
Yeah.
coaching, content, education, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, initially I got into college for physics engineering, believe it or not. And I thought that I was just going to spend a lot of time going through, computer programming and, stuff like that. And I got into college and I realized like I'm spending way more time at the gym, playing pickup basketball, lifting weights, like, and that's really what I liked doing. And spending time on the programming, not so much. So I shifted my major towards exercise science after the first year and pursued an exercise science degree. At pretty much the same time, started personal training clients and just filled my calendar with as many clients as I could and as much experience as I could. That led to some really great opportunities. I was at Ohio State. It's a really big school. They have lots of great connections. There's also a really good network of strength and conditioning around Columbus, Ohio. So for anyone who wants to learn, like maybe you're a younger coach, like Columbus, Ohio is a great place to be. Affordable cost of living. They have elite FTS, West Side Barbell, and then a lot of great private strength and conditioning facilities, as well as great high school programs. Um, Long story short, though, I got through my exercise science degree, still had a lot of questions, and decided to just kind of go out there and start working. Decided by getting rejected to all my PT schools that I applied to. Then that took a year. I got a high school strength conditioning job, which was the probably the best job that I've ever had. It was super fun. I had like up to 70 girls at a time, three different teams, and just we just got in there, and they were, just getting into weightlifting. So they're like, do I bench press with my hand this way or this way? It's like, okay, hands over the bar like that. So, but I learned a lot in that, early experience with large groups of athletes, and also started my own personal training business at the time. Reapplied to PT school after, maybe a little bit better essays, retaking anatomy and getting that A, leveling up, my focus and things like that. And ended up going back to Ohio State for physical therapy school. And throughout PT school, I kind of continued the personal training business that I was doing, and then also started educating people. And that kind of started by just tutoring somebody in regards to studying for their CSCS exam. And then I thought, okay, a lot of these concepts are pretty interesting to me. Like, and I think that the videos that are out there are maybe a little bit too complicated, or it's kind of like a professor at a whiteboard with like a blurry, shaky camera. I'm like, I think I could do a little bit better here and just explain these concepts a little bit more simply. And I started doing that in around 2020, and basically have made a weekly or every other week YouTube video since. And then it started off with one or two Instagram posts, and now we've been up to like three or four or five a week for the past 4 or 5 years, and just kind of refining, the process of taking a complicated idea and thinking like, what would somebody who's learning this idea, like, where are they at right now, and how can I, give them just a little bit more to kind of refine that knowledge and help them understand a concept a little bit better. So that's a lot of what I do now. I still do consultations with athletes who have like certain movement limitations or pain, um, and then also some online training, primarily with endurance athletes, and then a little bit of in-person work with a gym down the road here. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my story and where I'm at now. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, cool. I think with that, what I find that quite is well, first thing, in terms of around Columbus, when you mentioned some of the gyms that are there, it's kind of like a hit list of the gyms that I can imagine a lot of people listening have heard of. I know I certainly have in such a
Mhm,
in such a small space, which I can imagine it was pretty cool, kind of learning
mhm,
around that area. And I think one thing, and this might be a little bit of a tangent, but when you've said there about learning those complex topics, I can only speak for myself, having gone to university and learning these things, but then sometimes it's a little bit like, how do I explain this? How do I put that in my own words? Do you think that
mhm,
you doing those YouTube videos and the Instagram posts that helps kind of sharpen your toolkit as well? Because you're always looking at these topics and thinking, well, how can I make this more digestible? Do you think that helps
mhm.
you in terms of your coaching as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's really why I do it in the first place is it just helps me refine my thinking because I think you can kind of think of a lot of the principles of strength and conditioning. You can kind of think of it at two levels. I guess like at one level would be like prescription, meaning like what are the sets and reps and exercise that I want to prescribe or give to somebody. And if you're making content, a lot of people just want prescription. They're like, what sets and reps should I do for this tendon pain, or sets and reps, or what exercises should I do for this or that? But I think, especially as coaches, we really want principles. We want to peel back the layers, the first principles, and interestingly enough, some of that comes back to like just basic physics and engineering principles, which is
Yeah.
kind of like I guess where I started. So I'm trying to always kind of pull from both the coach's lens and then also pull back to like the first principles of like why are these prescriptions the way that they are, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think sometimes, uh, people want to look at kind of, and I hope this makes sense, like the tip of the iceberg, just like the one thing. Whereas for
Hmm.
everything, for programming, movement, anything when it comes to strength, conditioning, fitness, sport, there's going to be that foundation or those foundation principles that it's always coming back to. And if those aren't applied, then the kind of the whole structure falls apart. And from
Yeah.
do you find from you mentioned there doing tutoring, a little bit of mentoring, that people
Hmm.
kind of get hung up at that tip of the iceberg rather than forget those things at the bottom that might sound really simple and maybe boring, but are actually,
Hmm.
no, look, these are the things that you need to still always revert back to in terms of knowledge and application.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the thing is, like, if you're an athlete, you're kind of relying on coaches to distill the why and the how into just the prescription. And then you're, as an athlete, responsible for following that. And maybe there are like a small percentage of athletes who do want to like learn even more. Maybe they want to coach in the future and get a little bit of the how and why. But most clients and athletes, you're just distilling to them kind of the end result. But for the coach themselves, I think there's a lot of really interesting detail under the surface that can help. So let's just take, for example, like I could tell you that an overcoming isometric for 3 sets or 5 sets of 5 seconds can increase your vertical jump height by about 3 to 7% for most athletes. So essentially just working back and forth between a really hard mid thigh pull and then like a counter movement jump or a drop jump or a depth jump or something like that. And that's pretty interesting. It's some pretty simple protocol. You could just do like 5 sets of 5 seconds between your jumps, and you can have higher outputs. And maybe higher outputs is good, but then as soon as I tell you that, there's probably, at least for the curious coaches out there who want to learn and evolve and continue in this field, they probably have like 10 follow-up questions. They're like, well, is that a temporary adaptation or is that like something that actually lasts and makes a difference long term? What if I space it out uh, and have more rest time in between? What is the right amount of rest time? Or what's the difference between doing a mid-thigh pull or a calf raise isometric, right? And how does that impact vertical jump? And there's like 10 other questions that they can come up with. And I think it's actually important to know some kind of basic principles of how the nervous system responds to stimuli, how the muscular system responds to stimuli, because it kind of helps you at least have an educated guess towards what would happen with all your extra questions, right? Like with more rest or different exercises. And then you can always go in and actually test. And that's what actually what helps you kind of refine the protocols and also change the protocols to the specifics of your case. Because you might have an athlete that responds differently than average. You might have a time constraint that's different, or like just uh, there's a lot of other factors that come up in real life. So that's kind of why you have to understand both the protocols and the principles.
Yeah, definitely. And a key word that you said there is more of a kind of like educated guess because it's kind of
Mhm.
everything then when we're working with data and putting plans in place is kind of the best guess to head in the right direction. And I can't
Mhm.
remember. I remember having a conversation with another coach, and I think it was a case of you're not trying to get it, 100% right. You're just trying to make sure that you don't get it wrong. I can't remember the full wording of it, but
Yeah.
making sure that you don't go completely in the other direction. But if you're kind of getting close to heading in the right direction, then you can start refining rather than just kind of going in and thinking, I want to try and do everything. I'm going to cover absolutely everything
Yeah.
in this program, but then you've got no idea what's actually working. Whereas if you have those principles and they can apply it and think, right, okay, what is it that this athlete needs? What is their weak points? What do they need to strengthen up? What do they need to develop in their athletic attributes for their sport? And then at least then you kind of, there's that phrase of moving the needle a little bit further forward. You're trying to
Mhm.
make that progression. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, and I think what actually helps practically for a lot of coaches is looking for like the guardrails rather than looking for like the optimal point, if that makes sense. Because if you're kind of looking for one thing that's optimal, you're never going to find it because that optimal point depends on a lot of individual context, right? But if you look for guardrails, you're like, okay, what is the thing that would tell me this is not enough? What is the thing that would tell me that this is too much? And that's a lot of times comes down to like, your testing system, like just testing and seeing like, is the athlete getting better or not? And then also just understanding just basic principles of recovery and overload.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And one there, which goes quite into the kind of one of the main topics of the. I know we went on a little bit of a tangent there, but I think it's all relevant content is when we're talking about kind of testing and seeing how athletes are responding to training. There's as the name strength chat would suggest, we're going to dive into a little bit of strength training, but
Yeah.
there's kind of the strength that athletes will show in terms of the gym, whether that be
Hmm.
Olympic lifts, the static lifts, the isometrics that we've mentioned there, but then
Hmm.
also the strength that they show on the field. And I
Hmm.
kind of wanted to. This is a little bit of a two-parter really, but
Hmm.
what's the difference between both from kind of your experience and your definition of it, and where do you think sometimes those lines get blurred, and from a coach's point of view, they kind of sometimes put more eggs in one basket compared to the other, and maybe don't appreciate that one needs to take precedence over the other, if that is
Hmm.
actually the case, if both of those make sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great question about like how do we know when we're building strength in the gym if that's going to translate to the field? And it sounds like also just like how do we know when to push in kind of one area versus the other, and in like the training decisions that we're making. And this is obviously something that a lot of different coaches are thinking about, for different athletes and different outcomes. But I think there are again, let's take it back to like basic principles that we can stand on. And one is that whenever you're a beginner, you respond to almost anything. Like we know that specificity of training exists. Like if you want to sprint faster, you are going to at some point need to sprint or move fast, right? But we also see that beginners, pretty much anything works. Like
Yeah.
get stronger, and there's I guess like a broader um I guess you'd say like application of that. Like it improves performance across a lot of different disciplines. Like it improves their like muscular endurance, just because the higher your one rep max, the more that you can do with submaximal weight. So it doesn't really make sense for like a weak or an untrained athlete to do a lot of endurance training. Just improve one rep max, and everything kind of goes up. And similarly, it doesn't make a lot of sense for youth athletes to spend a lot of time on um, you know, very specific uh, exercises in terms of like high sport, like worrying too much about high sport specificity and joint angles, because again, they just don't have the broad base of strength first. So the muscle cross-sectional area is essentially your limiting factor for force production. It sets your ceiling. This is like the highest that you could reach. And I always like to think about that ceiling in a lot of different contexts. Like you're, but to keep it with strength for right now, like the more force that you can produce, the more force that you can produce quickly. Now, that's not always the case, right? Like we could kind of look at an athlete and then say they squat 200 pounds, just as an example. We could fast forward like 3 years. And if this athlete just specializes in back squat and does program after program and powerlifting competition after powerlifting competition, maybe 3 years later, they're squatting 450, right? And they're, I guess, like optimizing to that variable of one rep max squat. Now you could also assume a different trajectory 3 years forward, that this athlete progresses through 3 years of high school and they get stronger at back squat. They squat 400, but at the same time, they were also sprinting weekly. They were also doing change of direction. They were doing sport training. Now, this athlete didn't optimize to improve their one rep max squat, but by doing jumping and multi-directional movement and sprinting, they've developed a lot of coordination and between their muscles. They've developed a lot of neuromuscular efficiency and a variety of movement patterns, and they're just going to move better on a football field or a pitch if you're talking about soccer. Um, this athlete is likely more prepared than someone that did really highly specialized training to focus on one thing. And this is why a lot of adult athletes, like adults like my age or whatever, in like their 30s, that want to get back to sprinting and jumping, they already have like the strength. So in that context, a lot of times they have a decade or more of strength training experience and not much on the neuromuscular side and the sprinting side. It's kind of more important to start to introduce like true low ground contact time plyometrics, consistent sprint work, speed exposure, like the stuff that they haven't had. But
Yeah.
again, for the youth athlete, it makes more sense to build the strength first in most cases.
Yeah.
So I think like back to first principles, you have to think about what does this athlete actually need. Now, to answer like the second part of your question is like it's like when does the strength I guess like translate to the field? Well, stronger athletes do tend to change direction faster. They do tend to jump higher. They do tend to sprint faster. And I think it's pretty rare that an athlete actually gets to the point where they're like that increasing their one rep max wouldn't yield improvements in performance. Like that's, for like an American football player, that's like usually like you're squatting like 600 plus. At that point, like I'm like, okay, now we can start to talk about like risk reward or just like, spending more time with some other training methods. Maybe we introduce what do you call it? Like bands and chains accommodating
Yeah.
resistance. Maybe we introduce dynamic effort. Maybe, and they probably already have done this to some extent, but like maybe we prioritize some of these strategies because they're just so strong already. Um, but there's also some science to decide this because you can use something like a dynamic strength index and just see like, okay, mid thigh pull force, like that's their ceiling for force production. Like how much force can they produce? And then when they actually jump, how much do they produce? And long story short, dynamic strength index is a ratio of how much of your force you're producing during dynamic movement. So some athletes produce 60% of their force potential, if that makes sense. Some athletes produce 80%. I've seen some athletes produce 95 and some athletes, believe it or not, even go over 100, which doesn't really make sense, but they're just so elastic that they're just really, really bad at producing isometric force and they produce everything when they jump. And that's the athlete like they need to get stronger, right? The athlete that's 90%, 100%, they're at their ceiling for force production, right? They're producing as much force dynamically as they can statically. So they just need to increase their ceiling, right? Whereas the athlete who's producing 50%, 60% of their potential, they need to actually learn how to apply that force potential that they have more quickly
Yeah.
because power is essentially like how fast can you utilize your strength. And you do need probably force plates to do good DSI testing. I've tried to like rig it up with like uh like a crane scale and it's kind of complicated and you max it out usually. So you kind of need force plates to do this. You can kind of though start to get the idea in your head. Like even if you don't have the force plates to do the testing, I think you can kind of start to look at athletes and understand like this athlete's really elastic, but they don't produce a lot of force. They jump 30 plus inches, but they squat, a plate and a half or whatever. You could start to get the idea without the testing, but I do think that if you're in the environment where you can do the testing, it does help you learn about this kind of to the next level. But I guess that's like some of the principles here between like, do you need to increase your potential and your ceiling for force production and get stronger? Most of the time, yeah. Or is it more of a priority though? And sometimes it is to prioritize the elastic demands, the rate of force development, the neuromuscular component, and just kind of learning to use the strength that you already have and coordinate it better.
Yeah, definitely. And as well, I think it goes back to what we were chatting about a little bit earlier in terms of what's going to be the best guess in terms of, what direction you need to go, because you've also
Yeah.
mentioned there quite a lot of data, information, and knowledge is used to make that decision. And you mentioned there of look, if that athlete is lifting a certain amount of weight, all right, cool. So it might be using chains or bands or using something else. And sometimes, like what you mentioned there about using force plates, I know a lot of the coaches that I've worked with or are friends with, sometimes they don't have a lot of access
Mhm.
to this kit, which I think is part and parcel of sometimes the struggles of being a strength conditioning in, depending on what level of the sport that
Sure,
you
yeah.
that, that you're at. And obviously at the elite level, they've got lots of toys and gadgets that you can use.
Mhm.
Whereas, unfortunately, not a lot of coaches don't have that luxury. So do you think
Mhm.
sometimes, when it's looking at and I hope I kind of get the wording of this right. When you're giving information to head coaches, or look, I want my team players or my athletes to be strong, fast, all this sort of stuff. That
Mhm.
just seeing weight going up on the bar is you can see that they're progressing. Just making them do sprints. Well, yes, they are actually running at fast times. Is where
Mhm.
sometimes coaches can feel. A comfort in their programming rather than trying to think about, right, okay, what can we use to have a look at strength versus power compared to, right, how can we adjust programming to look at some different variables, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a great question. And honestly, if I think back to like that high school strength and conditioning job that I was talking about earlier, like up to I think we had 78 girls at the like the peak. It was like the most in a weight room. It's like force plates would have absolutely hindered any progress that we can make, right? Because they don't even know to grab the bar this way or grab the bar that way, right? So our programming was super simple. It was like 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 8, 3 sets of 6, and then we ran with 3 sets of 6 for like 2 more weeks. And we just said like every week, get more weight on the bar, right? And I think we did like bench and squat and maybe we threw in like a deadlift or like did cycles of 6 weeks, but like basically it was pretty simple strength training, right? Like it
Yeah.
was just basic exercises. We did some, weighted chin ups, we did some Nordics and some hamstring accessory, like a little bit of accessory movements, but like it was pretty simple programming. And to operate, like I think we had like 10 racks, which is a ton for a high school. But to operate a room with like that many people, like you have to just be efficient and just kind of basic. So everybody's got a piece of paper and wrote down the weight they used every week. Um, and you could see the numbers go up in terms of squat performance. We didn't even do 1 rep max testing the first few weeks of like conditioning, and but we did over time, over the course of like 3 months, and you would see that 1 rep max go up, and that was a good indicator. And again, you can add like to this with whatever technology you have. You could do um, you could do sprint timing if you have timing gates. That's ideal. If you don't have timing gates, just do longer sprints, right? Because
Yeah.
the 10-meter sprint, it's just not accurate with a stopwatch. 40-meter, it's a little dicey, but for like a high school athlete who's running like in the high fives, it could be reasonable. But I would probably do like a 60-meter or even a 100-meter test, and just it's not, you're going to get some amount of sprint, but you're also going to get some amount of like slowing down at the end, especially at the high school level. But just do something testing before and after, do an intervention and show some progress. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
would try to perform like pick. And now that I think about it, we also used like broad jump. We used some other like just like triple. I think we did like triple single leg jump. That's one that I've used in like a rehab context a lot. Like there's a lot of different hop testing and things like that that just require like a tape measure on the ground. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
tests you can do with no equipment, and definitely just rely on those if you don't have the complicated equipment.
Yeah, definitely. Because as well, there's things around that because, yes, there's a lot of research information out there, which is great. Whereas, sometimes the coaches out there with the teams that they're working with, they might not be able to have that. Whereas, going back to what we said about before about the principles and the foundation, these tests were the first tests that done. They're going to give you some information of how you can see progress from there. Because yes, even though the podcast is strength chat and strength is the foundation, but you need to be able to apply that so that they can perform because you do need to be able to have speed, have power for, change of direction, for, a change in acceleration or speed for most sports. And when it
Hmm.
comes to again touching on the programming side of things, um,
Hmm.
what comes with working within strength and conditioning is obviously pressure of looking after athletes, especially if you mentioned you're working with endurance athletes. I can imagine they're individual sports, individual athletes, and there's
Hmm.
always that pressure of look, I don't want to injure them,
Hmm.
or put them at risk. So on the flip side of that, in terms of yes, we want to be able to. You mentioned there about if you're an athlete squatting 600 pounds, they're going to have that level of strength. Whereas sometimes, do you think the flip side of it is that strength isn't pushed enough and people dive like what you mentioned there about the 90 to 100%, those athletes that need to focus on a little bit more strength, who are maybe a little bit more elastic, that the strength doesn't get pushed as much because there's a risk then that they might tweak their back or knee or whatever it may
Yeah.
be when they're doing a little bit of strength training on the kind of the flip side of things.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely see it, and I think I see it a lot in the space that I work with endurance athletes, just like like super afraid of even starting resistance training at all. And for that athlete, there's like just the structure of the athletes I'm working with. 600-pound squat is not even something that's I realistically think is possible for any of them. Um, just 'cause people have different builds. So I think in the context of American football player at a high level, like that's maybe the target to get to with strength before you have to worry about, you know, having too much strength. Like, but for an endurance athlete, I don't even really think about having too much strength. Like, I think it's more just about like finding the entry point that they're comfortable with, and then seeing where you can progress. And also, I do think there's some specificity element to working with endurance athletes. Like early on, I think we talked about my exposures to West Side Barbell and Elite FTS and kind of like a really a large powerlifting community. I think there's a lot of people in that crew who would just say like, "Oh, these athletes, just everybody just needs to squat more," right? And they'd get like an endurance athlete and just say they just need to barbell back squat more, right? Like they can only barbell back squat 95 pounds, so what we need to do is barbell back squat for the next, year until they can squat, 300 pounds, and then they'll be a better endurance athlete. I don't think that's necessarily the best plan. One, because it's never going to work; they're never going to do it and stick with it. And then two, because of the context of their sports seasons, their nutrition, their the stress that's put on in from different running sessions, and also the way that that strength will translate. Because having a 300-pound squat doesn't make you a good endurance athlete. We know that from people who have a 300-pound squat. So I think for endurance athletes, there's a lot of very specific areas that do require a strength stimulus. I think it's really good to load the hamstring, the hip flexor, to load the lateral hip. And increasingly, I think that doing that in a closed chain context is far more valuable than doing it with open chain exercise. And what I mean by that is like a lot of runners come to me and they're like, "Oh, I've been doing these sideline leg raises and clamshells and a couple other basic like kind of rehab looking exercises." And they're like, "Oh, I've been doing this for 3 years at 3 sets of 10 each." And it's like, okay, well, has anything changed from these exercises? Not really. Like you're just kind of lifting your leg in the air. And even if you add a weight and you lift your leg in the air, at best, you're kind of in a very isolated way, um, loading a pretty small muscle. But it really doesn't change the way that your foot interacts with the ground, and it doesn't carry over to running as well. I think over the last like 5 years, especially, there's been really good information on uh, one thing called run specific isometric training, and then also just uh, I guess like reasonable like functional training. I think functional training kind of gets a bad rap sometimes because we think of it as like you know the crazy exercise or whatever gets like the most attention on the internet. But I think like functional training for a runner is like a barbell step up, right? Like
Yeah.
like doing a good exercise like a step up or a lunge, but with adequate weight. And that sounds like crazy. Like that's like, but that's like one of the most functional exercises that an endurance athlete can do is just like, instead of just doing a step up with 10-pound dumbbells, like get like work up to the fact like a strong endurance athlete who wants to have like the lateral hip that can maintain their body position with multiple times their body weight ground reaction forces through a 3 hour marathon. Like you need to have a really strong lateral hip because like we said, like they're pretty weak. Increase the 1 rep max potential, like the ceiling for force production, and the endurance of that lateral hip improves. uh, because they're weak. Like, don't go train muscular endurance if you don't have the base level of strength to begin with. So just do sets of 5 or 6 heavy step ups, but do them really heavy, like and challenging. And obviously, you have to build up to this, but I've had a lot of success working with runners and just programming basic blocks of training that involve heavy step ups. Instead of doing like a sideline leg raise, let's get you in a side plank position and then raise the top leg, right?
Yeah.
And now the bottom leg's at least loaded as well, and it's just a better position for training like your lateral core at the same time, versus like a clamshell or just like a basic leg raise. Um, Other exercise that I've used, calf raises. These are almost never programmed very well. Everybody does, you either grab like one dumbbell and you stand on the edge of a step and you do like a single leg calf raise, and it's, okay, you have 30 pounds in your hand. If you're really like trying to push yourself that way, it's not enough. I've had like endurance athletes that were doing that exercise. Then I set them up differently. I essentially do the same position as like a step up where you have one foot on a box, barbell on your back, but then just do a calf raise on the back leg. And a lot of times these athletes can do 135, 185, and they were doing 30 pounds, right? And a little bit of weight is taken up by the front foot. So it's not exactly the same, but just do this yourself. And the other benefit of that is that, and this kind of gets down to some like biomechanics, but your hip is in hip extension, which is where you need to be strong in the gait cycle. And you're pushing off from a position of about 15 to 30 degrees of dorsiflexion. So it gives you like the strength in the right position and context, and the toe off is a lot more functional, I guess. Like, so there's small changes like that you can make to your athletes programming, and obviously I've spent a lot of time like thinking and refining my programming for the endurance community because that's like who I've written the most programs for, at least in the last 2 years or so. But you could think about this for any athlete, and specificity, I still do think mostly comes down to like the way that you're programming, not like highly specific exercises, because I think you can go too far with like you don't want to match like exactly the demands of running. So you don't need to like make it look exactly like running, but you just need to like think about the positions and the joint angles of running. Where do you need strength? Like like endurance athletes need to be really strong with shallow knee flexion and hip flexion, like in essentially the mid stance position of running. So doing like a mid thigh pull as an isometric, or even better than that, I think a knee iso push where you're kind of slightly squatted down on one leg and driving into a fixed barbell, like those have been really important and beneficial. And I think it also it meets the athlete where they're at with what they're willing to do, because an athlete feels okay like pushing really hard into this barbell in this run specific position. They're like, okay, I could see how this is going to help my hip and my knee and um, my strength for running, and they could feel it like carry over to how they feel at the end of their long runs, at the end of their races. Whereas if you just say like do a barbell squat, and we're going to do this every week, and they're like, okay, well now my adductors are sore and I can't run as well, and now I don't know if my form's right, and it just some specificity of training can solve some of the problems that you end up running into. If that makes sense. I might have
Yeah,
taken that on a tangent, but did that answer your question?
yeah, absolutely. I think there was a couple of things that when you were talking there, just to kind of pick out a little bit, in terms of um, that fundamental knowledge that we spoke about right at the start. Right, okay, how can we apply that to the athlete that's in front of you? And I think sometimes, you mentioned a couple of times there of things that don't get programmed enough, like what you mentioned about the calf raises. And what was actually going through my head, a guy that I used to work with, he works with a lot of he works his expertise is speed. He's worked with sprinters, but he also works with a lot of team sport athletes kind of in their off season. And I always
Hmm.
remember he did similar exercises to what you mentioned in terms of loading the calf up. And I think
Hmm.
sometimes because those exercises get overlooked or sometimes are seen to be, I don't know, maybe too simple, or like how much impact can they actually have on the
Hmm.
program? I think sometimes, and you said it there, the most exciting program that's on the internet, or a little bit like, I don't know if you've seen any of the stuff that Joel Seedman puts out there. Those
Hmm.
crazy exercises that you think, but what is that actually doing? Whereas actually that foundation, that fundamental exercises that you're doing, and then applying that in terms of where does, using the endurance athlete as an example, where do they need to be strong? Because you could get them really strong in the squat, like what you've said, and they would get strong. Do you know what I mean? Those numbers on the squat would go up. But is that
Hmm.
applicable to their sport? Where is it that they need to get strong? And I suppose that applies to on the flip side, when we were talking about kind of the American football players, they're really, really strong, but can they use that strength? Can they produce power? Can they produce force? Can they change direction? And I think that's where it comes into the programming side of things, where you were saying yourself there about over the last 2 years programming for endurance athletes, just trying to pick that process apart. And I suppose that kind of leads into the next question, if you like, that I had in mind or was going around my head is, do you think that's where, you know, ultimately coaches are based on the results that they get with their athletes, with the team that they're working with, and how they perform in competition? Do you think the success or failure of an athlete is going to come down to, how that coach is understanding what is needed of that athlete and those fundamentals? And if they don't get that right, then ultimately, that's going to impact their athlete's performance rather than how the athlete applies themselves in the strength and conditioning sessions. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will start with this. Like, um, athletes tend to know their body really well, especially really high level and well-trained athletes. They know if something's working or not. They tend to have a really good proprioceptive sense of their movement and awareness of like if something made a change or not. And I've been lucky to work with some mentors that were working with really high level athletes and just be around a lot of coaches and clinicians that worked at a high level. And I think the best ones always have some system for like feedback in like showing a before and after, and that doesn't have to come in like 4 or 6 week cycles. Like I think a lot of this comes down to like to within the session, like actually just recording an athlete changing direction and show, like pausing at different points and saying like why does this feel better going that way than that way, and why does this, and then asking them some questions and then being able to step in and kind of solve that problem specifically. Now, this does depend on the context you're working with. If you're working with very large groups of athletes, it's obviously very hard to do that in an individual level. So this more has to do with like kind of consulting or like one-on-one training or maybe private training. But, even whenever I was teaching groups of 20 to 30 athletes like a year or two ago, um, I still would try to find at least like kind of one opportunity per session per athlete, like try to get in there and give them like one specific cue and like and sit there and like kind of work with them long enough that they felt like a before, like a difference, like a before and after, like, and I think just that makes a really big difference in the outcomes that you get from training and how athletes feel from training because like I said, like I think they have a pretty good grasp on this in most cases, and it's really on the coach to actually make a change that they can feel and see. I've always done that, primarily with like kind of, I guess, like biomechanics based, I guess, like principles in a lot of meaning like where are we getting the movement from this exercise? Like, let's just say, like, a very basic example being like a trap bar deadlift. An athlete just like kind of yanking it off the ground. There's no pre-tension, so that they're obviously kind of feeling more like lumbar extension and maybe their neck's coming back, and they're not really feeling it through their legs, right? Like a pretty basic biomechanical based solution here is just developing pre-tension in the right areas, cueing to drive the ground down and push the ground away, and now all of a sudden it actually feels like a leg exercise again. Um, if you have a group of 6 or 8 athletes trap bar deadlifting, and you're doing 3 sets, like one or two, per set that you're getting to, you can get some of this individual cueing to even multiple athletes. So I think it's on the coach to figure out ways to do that. That's really at the heart of strength conditioning is giving coaching and cueing and programming decisions that are going to make an athlete feel like they made a difference with the training that they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well, it's funny. I literally had a conversation yesterday with a member in the gym, and I actually used one cue, which
Mhm.
a lot of the members got. It just clicked with them,
Yeah.
whereas this guy was like, "Yeah, basically, it didn't really make sense." And that's the thing where I think group training now is very popular, especially when it comes to strength and conditioning. If people are um, in like the off season or in camps or anything, or if you're working, obviously if you're working with teams, obviously it's going to be a group setting.
Mhm.
But it just changed it around slightly, and then all of a sudden he got more out of that exercise. He wanted to overload, wanted to increase the weight, wanted to overload it a little bit, got more out of that session, and progressed. And trying to find those cues, how to get the best out of it. Even if we're going from trying to use speed when we're doing anything, strength can be quite slow, right? We want to do
Hmm.
something faster, right? What's the cue? How are you gonna get the best out of them? Which I think is really important because yes, we've spoken about kind of like the programming side of things and how we can make the best guesses, how we can apply that knowledge, how we can apply the data and the science. But ultimately, it's going to come down to right, okay, what is it that that athlete needs? How can we make sure that we get the best out of them for that session, for that exercise, so then they progress. Um, Quite a lot of topics there,
Yeah.
Matt, that we chatted about. Some good tangents in there and some good information in there. But the last question that I like to ask for everybody listening, whether it's the athletes listening or the coaches listening, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom from everything that we've spoken about today, Matt?
Yeah, I think to like summarize the takeaway that I think a lot of athletes or coaches should take away from this conversation is like, when is specificity improving your outcomes versus when is specificity maybe not that important, right? And in a lot of contexts, we don't need to worry too much about specificity. Just get strong at the basic exercises, and watch your ceiling improve. Um, in a lot of other contexts, though, it can be beneficial to think through specificity, and we talked about that through the context of runners or athletes that run and building strength in very specific muscle groups and positions, and just loading effectively in those positions. And I think that's really the the way that people should think about specificity is like, how can I change the loading parameters, the like the way that I'm doing this exercise? How can I change that to truly meet the needs of this athlete, given all of the context of their needs and their training history? And I think maybe people have a little bit better of a lens to do that after this discussion. That's my hope, at least.
Yeah, nice. No, I think that was a good summary of what we've chatted about there. And as well, I think, there's a lot of information there on a lot of information out there on do this exercise, do this is the program and thing. And I think that's a lot of information that is kind of readily available. People can go and find that for
Mhm.
themselves. There's plenty of books, plenty of articles, blogs, podcasts. Whereas I think, what the aim, I hope, of this of this podcast is to how do we actually apply that? Because I know sometimes everyone, a lot of coaches get all of this knowledge, but then they have nowhere to apply it because there's that thing of right, I need more experience. We or they want to or people want to take
Yeah.
on people more experience. How do you get more experience? Well, it's about actually doing the things that are in the books, are in the blogs, but from hearing from coaches such as yourself who have that experience, it's like, right, okay, so actually it is a case of right, how do I piece all this together? How do I find out what they need just by making the best informed guess that you can, because I always think sometimes when it's a case of this is 100% the correct answer, this is the only thing, it's a little bit like, well, is it? What happens if you apply that and all of a sudden it isn't? Well, right, okay, you got to go back to the drawing board. Whereas if you have a little bit of wiggle room to be like, okay, we're going to give this a go, and then it gives you room to progress from there. So, yeah, really appreciated you taking the time to jump on today, Matt. For everyone listening who might have any questions about what we've spoken about today, want to reach out to you or see the content that you put out there, where could people find you or reach out to you, Matt?
Yeah, yeah, it depends on what you like to listen to. If you like podcasts, I do long form podcasts like this on the Movement System podcast. I also make YouTube videos, and like I said, I've been making one or two, one every week or two for the last like 5 or 6 years, and just trying to go really uh, deep on specific topics that I'm interested in, and Those are all at the Movement System on YouTube. And then Instagram, that's where I really try to make like kind of short graphics and videos with like one takeaway. So we cover like one topic and try to really hit like what you need to know about that and kind of an applicable takeaway as well. So that's on Instagram at the Movement System, and that's probably the best place to ask questions because I get into the messages there quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Matt, for taking the time to jump on. Like I say, I thought there was some really, really good content and information out there. So yeah, appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and thanks everybody for listening. Take care.